Thank you all so much for coming, especially in week 10. I know it's a lot. I don't want to say I'm going to bring us down necessarily, but the topic I want to talk about today very much sprung out of a class I'm teaching right now, Women in American Politics. A lot of my students are in the room right now, which I'm really excited about. But with the surge of reporting of women at the state legislative level and the federal Congress that have been victims of sexual assault and sexual harassment, I thought it important to talk a little bit about how, as frustrating as it might be, it's also not surprising that we have seen these kind of behaviors happen in the state legislatures and in the federal Congress, and then talk a little bit about what might be changing potentially. So imagine you are a person who has never been welcomed in a particular place or a particular club, but you've worked your whole life to try to feel worthy to be in that place, and you've worked twice as hard to be half as good, and you overcome all these obstacles. And let's say you finally are welcomed into this club. And you get there, and you're trying to figure out how to navigate the way it works. So you go to a colleague who's been there for a while, and you ask this person, what should I do? How do I make my mark here? I have a particular thing I want to achieve. How do I do it? And this is the first thing that you hear. So current Senator Claire McCaskill from Missouri, when she was a first-term state legislator, she had a bill she was trying to work through committee. And she goes to the chair of the committee, a senior gentleman in the chamber, and she says, can you give me some advice on what I should do? I really want to get this bill passed. And this is what he says to her. Imagine that you're new in your tenure in the Senate. And you're on the Senate floor, and you're talking to some colleagues, and a gentleman, a fellow senator, walks up to you, grabs you around the waist, and says, better not lose weight. I like my girls chubby. Senator Kirsten Gillibrand from New York. So again, this is one of your first forays into this club that you've been wanting to join for so long, and this is what you come up against. Or imagine you're on the House floor talking to a colleague, and you're having just a regular old conversation about the day and what's going on in the chamber, and he tells you he's been thinking about you when he's in the shower. Yes, ew, gross, all of that. So the imagery of this, and I wanted to start with this because we think about those who have been welcomed and not welcomed in the political process, whether it be from the Constitution, the way that it was originally written, or ability to serve in the institutions. And so we talk about often as women as political outsiders. They had to argue their way into the Constitution to have full citizenship. But just because they are granted protection under the Constitution does not mean that they're treated the same, particularly in institutions that were created for and by men and are perpetuated by a masculinized ethos. Shout out 312. Okay. We think about these women who tried to break inside who were on the outside. So we think about someone like Alice Paul. Some of you may be familiar with her, and my Sankofa students may remember going and seeing some of the things that she did in DC. And all she wanted to do was try to get women the right to vote and secure suffrage. And she was jailed for it and institutionalized for it. She just wanted to give women the opportunity to be political insiders at the very basic level. Okay? We look at Jeannette Rankin, who was the first woman ever elected to Congress sworn in 1917. Okay? First woman elected to Congress. All she wanted to do was serve Montana. That's all she wanted to do. And it took till 1917 for her to be elected to the House of Representatives, or to Congress, excuse me. We look at Fannie Lou Hamer. Some of you may be familiar with her, or maybe a little more, a little less. Fannie Lou Hamer, an average, everyday woman in Mississippi who just wanted to get black people registered to vote. Beaten, jailed, all because she wanted to secure the thing at the most basic level that we are supposed to get as citizens of the United States. We look at Shirley Chisholm, first African-American woman elected to Congress in 1969, ran for president in 1972. Really exciting stuff, right? And all she wanted to do, as she talks about, is she just wants to serve. She wants to be welcomed into these institutions and welcome others into these institutions and finally be considered a political insider. Now, what I'm going to talk about as we move through the rest of the talk is that even when women have been welcomed into the institutions, it doesn't mean the things that oppressed them outside don't still oppress them inside. And once they are able to come in, those who have controlled the process for so long and the culture around that have continued to treat them in ways that contain them and lock them out, which is why I talk about women on the inside looking in. Let's look at a couple more examples. We look at Sandra Day O'Connor, the first woman Supreme Court Justice. Shout out to Dr. Mark here, and the current 3 women we have on the Supreme Court. We love RBG and all that she talks about with equality for women, but getting women on the bench, and particularly now having a woman of color on the bench, took a really, really long time to get there. And the research tells us that, for example, women on the Supreme Court get interrupted more than men, and not only interrupted by justices, but interrupted by the attorneys. Doesn't happen to the male justices. And then finally, we look at this woman here, who was able to, for the first time, secure a major party nomination and stand on that stage at a convention, and who on the night of November 8, 2016, actually got electoral college votes for the first time in our history. We had a woman do that, right? But for those of us, all of us who lived through the 2016 election, we know that this was not without toil, and we know that sexism was a force that affected the way that she was evaluated and so forth. So again, I want to continue to talk a little bit about how this containment works. I love this quote here because basically what it tells us, and for my students who know how much I love institutions and how much I talk about institutions, and I've been tweeting about it because everyone so far has said the word institution in a presentation, that institutions are made up of those who comprise it, right? And those who control access and control the rules and who wrote the rules and then can change it there. And so this idea that the dominant group is the one that controls it, so then the question is, okay, all right, ladies, you want to play? You got to pay. It's a pay-to-play situation is what I'm calling it. You want to be welcomed into this masculinized culture? You want to be welcomed into this institution that has been created by and has sort of served male interests? Well, then you have to pay. I don't want to call it hazing necessarily, because it's, of course, much more serious than that. But it got me thinking as I started thinking about it this way, this pay-to-play. It got me thinking about what is a woman's currency? What can she offer to play? And what we are finding out more and more is that she can offer favors, a certain kind of favor that could get her the legislation that she wants passed, or could allow her to ascend to a particular committee assignment. The currency rests and resides in the private sphere, in her sexuality. And we see this in some interesting research, and in particular, a woman named Karen Basby Anderson writes this piece about using certain words to contain women. And in particular, what she talks about is that when a woman in a position of power is depicted in a sexual way, her power then rests in that femininity and that sexuality, and it's a weak substitute for actual political power. So you don't get to be seen as an equal to me and have the same power as me because you're a woman. And so to make you feel that, and so that you know that, I'm going to use certain words or certain behaviors to put you back in the place where you belong. And what this continues to do for women who worked so hard to have any, as she says here, political agency, is it puts them back, it relegates them back to the private sphere, which is where they should have always been. And once they sort of broke out of the private sphere and got into these male-dominated institutions, they need to be contained. And it happens in sort of, we're going to talk about this a little bit more, but containing them with their sexuality and continuing then to lock them out when they back away to no longer be assaulted or harassed. It serves sort of two different purposes. This is currently the women that serve in Congress. So one of the things about this, it's one of the rare places where women make the same amount of money as men. If you are, other than being in the leadership in the House and the Senate, if you are the average everyday member of Congress, doesn't matter what color you are, what party you're from, what gender, you make the same amount of money. It's kind of great. And every vote weighs the same. Right? One vote doesn't weigh more than another. It's one of the places, one of the professions where there's some actual baseline equality. But the problem with that is that once those who did not create the institution are in the institution and are starting to make gains and are seen as equals, there has to be some containment. And Hilda Solis, a former representative in the House, what she talks about as she recounts her experience being sexually harassed when she was a House member, is that it is very clear that the male colleague that she talks about does not see her as an equal. So she should be one, but she is not, because they are being contained. To keep them from having the influence, to keep them from feeling welcomed, to make sure that they know your value rests in a particular place, and I am going to talk about this, and I'm going to make you uncomfortable because I want to keep you out. They have to be contained. This takes us to the Me Too campaign, so to speak. Now, this actually starts about 10 years back by a political advocate, and it gained some traction about 10 years ago, but now it was brought back within the past couple of weeks. And what this did was, and I think most of us have been paying attention to this, have created a new conversation about sexual assault and sexual harassment, starting with the Harvey Weinstein case, and then we've seen it sort of spread across. So what ends up happening right after this is there are 140 women in the state of California who've been in the state legislature there, and they draft a letter and create an organization. And in this letter, they say, it's enough. We've had experiences where we've been grabbed, we've been forcibly kissed, we have been put in situations that is completely uncomfortable, like a House member or senator from the state will come to their room at night with beer and sit with them and ask them to have conversations that are inappropriate or do things that are inappropriate, okay? This happens in the state of California. What we have seen since this happened in the state legislature in California is the following states all have reports of similar circumstances. And this is just some of them. Now, in some of these states, the men in question have lost positions in the chamber, but of course have not been expelled or anything like that because they have to be voted out. Some have resigned. But what is especially problematic about this happening at the state level is this is the first time that most women have served political office. And is this the culture that they have, is this what it's going to be now, right? And this is especially problematic for young female aides. If this is, they want to serve, to go back to what Whitney was talking about, and be part of the citizenry that does something, and they serve in these institutions, but they are young and they are eager, and that's obvious. And they're more likely to be taken advantage of and then not want to say anything because they want to stay. And this is where the power that that dominant force has, is that silence. If you want to stay here and keep paying to play, you're not going to say anything about it. So this was happening at the state level, which takes us to the Me Too Congress campaign. Jackie Spear, who's a representative from California, she talks about her time as a staffer in the House of Representatives when she was young, and she was pushed up against a wall and forcibly kissed by a House member. She talks about tongue down my throat kiss by a House member. And at the time, well, this is obviously a while back, she becomes a member of the House and she starts to try to introduce legislation to require sexual assault training, sexual harassment training, and also to make the reporting process easier. Because right now, a lot of the very little amount of protection that female members have does not apply to staffers. And we're seeing that this kind of exploitation is happening particularly with staffers. So Jackie Spear talks a little bit about the importance of changing the reporting, making it easier for women they don't have to go through so many hoops and go through mediation, because it ends up falling on them to prove that this person did it, right? Which is a lot of what we see with victim blaming and rape culture and so forth. So we look at it, and I'll talk about this more in just a second, but we look at an institution like Congress where it's all about who has the power and using it in a way to contain others from having power and continuing to have an advantage. And it makes a ripe environment for these kinds of behaviors to occur. There's a piece in the New York Times from earlier this year by Stolberg, in which she says is at its core, sexual harassment is about power, and politics is the ultimate power profession. For any of us that know anything about sexual assault, we know that it is absolutely about power. It's about being dominant and letting the victim know you are dominant. It is a way to contain them from having power and from being seen as equals, and especially in an institution where women are now seen as equals. This is a strategy that is, I hate to use the word, but it is useful, and it's an environment that is ripe for this kind of containment. And the last thing here is talking a little bit more about the staffers as well. But you just want to be the girl that can hang, right? At the end of the day, You've worked so hard to be part of this boys club, and all you want to do is be in it. And if you have to be kissed every once in a while, or be grabbed every once in a while, and the male members know that they can do it and get away with it because you will let them, they continue to contain you. Thank you very much.